Well, hello and welcome back to another week of Adult Sunday School here at Holy Cross Lutheran Church. We are continuing our journey through the book of Acts as we follow Jesus' followers and see what they get up to after Jesus' ascension. We're on basically chapter 23 this week. A little bit of chapter 22 thrown in there, but it's mostly chapter 23. And we are really getting to the end of the book of Acts as Paul starts his way to getting to Rome. We're almost there, but he's kind of in the beginning process of getting himself to Rome. So last week, Paul finished his second missionary journey and headed back to Jerusalem, and he gets himself caught up in a riot because people thought incorrectly that Paul had brought a Gentile into the temple, which was, a big no-no. He ends up impressing the commander of the Roman garrison, a guy named Claudius Lysius, who, after initially thinking he was a terrorist called the Egyptian, was surprised to find out he was actually a Roman citizen. But now that he knows Paul isn't a terrorist, he's even more confused about why the people were rioting. And he really wants to find out. So let's dive in with Acts chapter 22, verse 30, and see what the commander does next and see what happens to Paul. The commander still wanted to know the truth about why Paul was being accused by the Jews. Therefore, the next day, he ordered the chief priests and the entire Jerusalem council to assemble. Then he took Paul out of prison and had him stand before them. So the commander does the smart thing. He gets everybody together, the whole Sanhedrin, the high council of all the religious leaders, because he really needs to find out why, of all people to be mad at, everyone is mad at Paul. Because as far as he can tell, there's no reason for a huge riot to break out because of that guy. So, what happens next? Paul stared at the council and said, "Brothers, I have lived my life with an altogether clear conscience right up to this very day." The high priest Ananias ordered those standing beside Paul to strike him in the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God is about to strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit and judge me according to the law, yet disobey the law by ordering that I be struck." So Ananias was the high priest from 47 to about 52 AD. He stopped being high priest because he was, kind of curiously enough, because of what happens in this passage, he was accused of acts of violence by the then governor of Syria, stood trial in Rome and was acquitted, but after all that, he was no longer high priest. He actually ended up dying at the beginning of the First Jewish-Roman War in 66 because he was considered to be too friendly with Rome. And in a somewhat ironic twist, it was actually his son, Eleazar, who initiated the rebellion by refusing to offer sacrifices to the offer sacrifices for the Roman emperor in the temple. So it's just kind of a weird thing with Ananias, but he was rather well known for being a somewhat violent person. And so it's just kind of funny that Paul is here saying, you hit me, and yet you're going to judge me according to the law when you're not supposed to hit me according to the law. Because Paul is claiming his innocence and he gets hit, but Paul says it's contrary to God's law to have someone beaten for no reason. They have to be convicted of something. And Paul calls them whitewashed walls, which I don't think anyone would like very much. So what, this is going to be a little bit of an offensive thing. So what happens next? Those standing near him asked, "You dare insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Brothers, I wasn't aware that he was the high priest. It is written, you will not speak evil about a ruler of your people." So there's a couple ways that you can take this. there's the way to take it that Paul is just actively insulting the high priest right now. Saying that, this guy doesn't deserve to be a high priest. And so Paul is just railing into him, continuing with the whole whitewashed wall thing and just saying, this guy is nobody and I don't care who he is. He's definitely not the high priest. There's another school of thought that Paul just has really bad eyesight and he didn't actually recognize the guy as the high priest. And my personal favorite is that Paul's just kind of being snarky. They say, you dare insult the high priest. And Paul's like, this isn't a high priest that I follow. The high priest I follow is Jesus. With that, that kind of attitude. So there's a lot of different ways to take it. I always will prefer the snarky response, but you almost kind of lean towards maybe Paul didn't know he was the high priest. But people didn't really like this. But then Paul does something really clever. So verse 6, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, Paul exclaimed in the council, "Brothers, I'm a Pharisee and a descendant of Pharisees. I am on trial because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead." These words aroused a dispute between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. This is because the Sadducees say there's no resurrection, angel, or spirit, but the Pharisees affirm them all. Council members were shouting loudly. So Paul, knowing full well his audience here, plays actually a really smart move. You've got two groups of people in a room, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They have very different beliefs on some very core issues regarding the interpretation of the scriptures. In large part, it all kind of comes down to the Sadducees only acknowledge the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, as scripture, but the Pharisees acknowledge all of what we now know as the Hebrew scriptures as the canon. So because of this, a lot of different beliefs kind of start to pop up. The Sadducees, as we see in the reading, don't believe in resurrections, angels, or spirits. And the Pharisees do. And Paul here is going, this is because of the resurrection of the dead. And the reason for this is the Sadducees, because they only acknowledge those 5 books of Moses, the 5 books of the law, they don't see any of this other, they don't see anything about a resurrection in those books. But you can very easily see things about a resurrection in the other ones. So Paul gets his team, the Pharisees, on his side by saying that this is all about the resurrection. And of course, never mind that the Pharisees' idea of the resurrection of the dead and Paul's idea of the resurrection of the dead in Jesus Christ are two very different things. It's still a really smart move because it distracts the whole council away from Paul. So, of course, now things are starting to get a little crazy, and he got the passionate religious people in a passionate religious argument and no longer arguing about him. So, Pharisees now are saying, hey, our fellow Pharisee, he's in trouble, and it's probably the Sadducees who are up to this. And it just so happens that the high priest is probably a Sadducee. They tended to be a little bit more friendly with Rome than the Pharisees were. But we don't know for sure. There's nothing I could find out about Ananias, the high priest, about what party he belonged to. It's just my guess that he is a Sadducee. So moving on. Some Pharisees who were legal experts stood up and insisted forcefully, "We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or angel has spoken to him?" The dispute became so heated that the commander feared they might tear Paul to pieces. He ordered soldiers to go down and remove him by force from their midst. Then they took him back to the military headquarters. So the Pharisees take Paul's side, continuing to argue their interpretation of Scripture against the Sadducees' interpretation of Scripture. And the argument gets so intense that now Paul's plan seems to have backfired a bit because things are getting out of the control, and the commander brings Paul back to the headquarters for Paul's own safety. And, things are a little crazy. So it makes you wonder where all this is going. What is going to happen next? And what happens next is really unsurprising if you've been paying attention, but also pretty cool and has to be incredibly reassuring for Paul. Verse 11, the following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Be encouraged. Just as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so too you must testify in Rome." And so now we've got a clear picture. This is what's going to happen for Paul. Just as he proclaimed the good news about Jesus here in Jerusalem and really everywhere else, his next step now is going to Rome itself to preach the gospel in the center of the empire. Now all the reasons for Paul going to Jerusalem and getting arrested are starting to be clear. And we'll find out in the next couple chapters that essentially what happens is Paul, with some odd and unfortunate detours along the way, gets the Roman Empire to pay for him to go to Rome. Because one of the rights that you have as a Roman citizen is to be able to petition even the Caesar to hear your case at trial. And that's precisely what Paul is going to do. But all is not entirely well, and things are about to get very interesting for Paul here in the next couple verses. The next morning, some Jewish leaders formulated a plot and solemnly promised that they wouldn't eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 people were involved in the conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have solemnly promised to eat nothing until we have killed Paul. You and the council must explain to the commander that you need Paul brought down to you. Pretend that you want to examine his case more closely. We are prepared to kill him before he arrives." So you get these folk whose, let's say, their zealousy for their version of what is right overcomes their good sense. And they swear an oath that they will neither eat nor drink anything until Paul is dead, and dead at their hand. So this is the plot. They plan to basically have the chief priest say, "Hey, we want to continue examining this guy." And as he's being transferred from the headquarters to wherever the Jewish council is going to meet, that's when these conspirators will kill Paul. Now, it's an interesting number that Luke rounds to here. 40 is a number that shows up a lot. We get 40 days of Jesus being tempted in the wilderness, 40 years of wandering for the people of Israel after their lack of faith before they went into the promised land. And there's 40s that show up a lot, including the season of Lent is 40 days if you don't count Sundays and start counting from a really odd place. It's complicated. But it's just kind of a very biblical number for Luke to round to here. But there's a problem with this plot. Somebody finds out about it. So verse 16. Paul's sister had a son who heard about the ambush, and he came to the military headquarters and reported it to Paul. Paul called for one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander because he has something to report to him." He took him to the commander and said, "The prisoner Paul asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to tell you." The commander took him by the hand and withdrew to a place where they could speak privately. He asked, "What do you have to report to me?" He replied, "The Jewish leaders have conspired to ask that you bring Paul down to the council tomorrow. They will pretend that they want to investigate his case more closely. Don't fall for it. More than 40 of them are waiting to ambush him. They have solemnly promised not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, awaiting your consent. So first off, Paul has a sister and a nephew? Well, if you want more information, there isn't any. That's all we know. We know that Paul has a sister and a nephew, and that's it. That's about all we know about Paul's family. This is their only mention in all of the Bible, and I couldn't actually find a whole lot of other information on them. But even though we have no idea who they are, Paul's nephew finds out about this plot, who tells Paul, who tells his nephew to go and tell the commander, and now the commander knows that his new friend Paul is in trouble. And there is this plot to have Paul killed. Now, the commander probably isn't keen on having someone in his custody killed anyways. That's going to make him look bad. But I get the impression that he might actually like Paul. And so the commander comes up with a plan to kind of keep Paul safe. Verse 22, the commander dismissed the young man, ordering him, "Don't tell anyone that you brought this to my attention." The commander called 2 centurions and said, "Prepare 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to leave for Caesarea at 9 o'clock tonight. Have horses ready for Paul to ride, so they may take him safely to Governor Felix." And he wrote the following letter. So in kind of cop movie style, the commander hides Paul's transfer to Felix in the midst of a military march. He decides to send a good chunk of his soldiers to go to Caesarea, which is just up the coast, and it's where the governor had his headquarters. He hides Paul in the midst of all these soldiers, so that when the soldiers march out, because nobody's going to mess with 470 Roman soldiers, Paul is in the midst of all these soldiers, and there's no way for the assassins to get to him. And so the conspirators are not going to be able to, they're not going to be able to get to Paul. And so Paul is protected. In case you were worried, which I don't assume you were, but the folk who came up with this plot to kill Paul, there were basically any number of ways to get out of a solemn promise. So they're fine. Like just if, in case you were worried about their well-being, having sworn not to eat or drink until Paul was dead, they're fine. They got out of their oath just fine. Oh, and then Felix. Felix is a guy we mentioned last week. He was the one who put down the Egyptians' rebellion, the guy that they thought Paul was. Felix is governor of Judea. He was a former slave of either Emperor Claudius or Emperor Claudius's mother. His brother, also a former slave, was Claudius's secretary of the treasury. And Felix's brother is probably the one who got Felix the gig as governor of Judea. And Felix was dirty. Felix loved bribes. He loved corruption. It was said that crime in Judea went up because of Felix's presence there, because he was so corrupt. And when bribes and corruption got bad enough, Felix would use his other love of extreme violence. So all in all, Felix is not a good dude, but he's the next best option for keeping Paul safe. So the commander writes a letter to Felix, kind of introducing Paul and explaining the situation. So in verse 26, Claudius Lysius, to the most honorable governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was almost killed by them. I was nearby with a unit of soldiers, and I rescued him when I discovered he was a Roman citizen. I wanted to find out why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their council. I discovered that they were accusing him about questions related to their law. I found no charge deserving of death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a conspiracy against his life, I sent him to you at once and ordered his accusers to bring their case against him before you. So there is a sense here that the commander, Lysius, is passing the buck along, but he's also doing it for Paul's own good. Paul is going to be a lot safer in Caesarea than he would be in Jerusalem. And it's interesting what kind of things get left out and how the commander tells this story to make himself look good. Lysius here is making it sound like this guy was threatened by the Jews, and I saved him because he's a Roman citizen, and we got to look out for our fellow Roman citizens, don't you know? And so I was doing an honorable thing for this fellow Roman citizen. Never mind that he only found out that he was a Roman citizen because he was about to have Paul beat. So, details. But the important thing is that Paul is going to be able to get out of town safely and get to Caesarea to have his trial before Felix instead of before Lysius. Because Lysius is kind of tired of this situation, I think. So, verse 31, following their orders, the soldiers took Paul during the night and brought him to Antipatris. The following day, they let the horsemen continue on with Paul while they returned to the military headquarters in Jerusalem. The horsemen entered Caesarea, delivered the letter to the governor, and brought Paul before him. After he read the letter, he asked Paul about his home province. When he learned that he was from Cilicia, the governor said, "I will hear your case when your accusers arrive." Then he ordered that Paul be kept in custody in Herod's palace. So Paul and the large detachment of soldiers go to Antipatris, which is about halfway to Caesarea. Once they get to Antipatris, which is a Roman fortress, they're pretty safe. So the rest of the soldiers go back with their distraction accomplished, and Paul and the horsemen, the 70 on horseback, went the rest of the way to Caesarea. And Felix is a bit intrigued by Paul because this is a strange situation, but I think Felix was also trying to pass the buck a little bit and not deal with who is now becoming a hot potato that no one wants to hold on to. I imagine that Felix asked Paul where he was from because Felix was trying to say, oh, you're not my problem. But unfortunately, Cilicia is part of Felix's jurisdiction, and so Paul is Felix's problem. And that ends chapter 23. So next week, we will find out what happens when Ananias and some others accuse Paul before Felix, and also find out just how much trouble a corrupt and greedy Roman governor can cause Paul in his mission to try to get to Rome. So that's that for this week. I hope you'll join us again next week as we continue in our journey through the book of Acts. If you have some questions or want to add to the discussion, leave them in the comment section below. And until next week, God bless.